Now, Michaela, why did your parents name you Michaela?
Well, it's actually a funny story. On my parents' first date, my dad said to my mom, "What do you think of the name Michaela?" And that is that. But there's a lot of men in my family named Michael, which is why they chose the spelling of my name the way it is. So.
It's a lovely name. That's a great romantic. It was their first date.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, your father obviously was pretty sure of himself.
Yeah. Yes.
You said you have about 20 some people to let in, is that right?
Yep. I'm just getting us live to Facebook before I do that, because it takes just a second to do.
Okay, we'll behave ourselves.
Okay, we are now live, so participants will start filing in. We'll give them a minute. Okay, we are now live. All right, we're live on Facebook. We've got a few participants here. Give it a couple more seconds and then I will start. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another virtual book club with the Birchfield Penny Art Center. My name is Michaela Warrows. I am an art educator at the Birchfield Penny, and I will be one of the facilitators of tonight's book club. Just a few quick tutorials of how to use the webinar. When you move your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A button. That button is where you can ask any questions to Kevin, and I will be asking them for you intermittently throughout the night. You can also use the chat feature to chat with all of the attendees and panelists as well. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann for an introduction.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Delighted to have you all with us. So sad that we can't be together in the conference room at the Birchfield Penny drinking wine like we usually do. But this, I think, will be just as fun. It's a great honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce Kevin Gaughan, and I have to make a confession, as I've already made to him, and that is that I looked up various sources, including Wikipedia, and not everybody in the world trusts Wikipedia, and rightfully so, but there is, in fact, a magnificent bio on Wikipedia. So if you want to look for more details about Kevin, you will find them there. But just a brief outline, because if you read the book, you already know a lot about him. Kevin is an attorney and also an advocate of government reform, and in particular, the establishment of regional government and regional consciousness within the Buffalo Niagara region. He became nationally recognized as an advocate of regionalism, largely because of the series of conferences that were held by Kevin, organized by Kevin, set up by Kevin, envisioned by Kevin at the Chautauqua Institution. And I'm hoping that we'll hear more about that during the course of the discussion tonight. Kevin has received some very impressive awards, including Buffalo News Citizen of the Year, also the Buffalo History Museum Red Jacket Medal, and other awards for his civic accomplishments. Kevin also has an impressive educational pedigree. Is an alum of Harvard University, got his law degree from Georgetown, and also attended the London School of Economics. In his political life, Kevin ran for office on several levels, Congress, mayoral runs in the city of Buffalo, state senator. There are many interesting efforts to take office. But as is said on the back of the book that hopefully you all have read, there's a wonderful indication of his many accomplishments, which ends by a wonderful quote that Mr. Gaughan has done more for the region without an office than most politicians have done with one. And I think that is the summary in and of itself of all of the wonderful accomplishments of our author tonight. There was also not another book that I discovered, but a detailed account of what various elected and appointed officials earn through a spreadsheet or a database, if you will, called the cost. And I'd like to know a lot more about that as well. That was an effort and a successful one to identify the monies that go to officials at various levels of government and how those salaries and expenditures compare to other jurisdictions that are of similar size in the area. And those efforts led to downsizing and reform and consolidation that were quite successful. So there are many other things. And again, if you have read the book, you will know about the significant efforts. I think that there will be lots of questions tonight about those efforts, but I'm going to invite Kevin to start out by giving us a general idea of the reason for his book, how it came about, what the original idea was. And then, because that book was copyrighted in 2003, there are many years from that day until this day, and we all would like to know more about the subsequent efforts that have been undertaken. So Kevin, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and we will all have rapt attention to what you have to tell us.
Mary, thanks ever so much. That was an immensely kind introduction, and I listened to most of it. I thought perhaps about halfway through you started making it up a little bit. First and foremost, it's a great honor, and I mean a great honor to be with folks who associate with our magnificent regional treasure of the Birchfield Penny Center, and Charlie Penny, as he was a friend of mine. And he was a very kind man, a rather enthusiastic supporter of some, not all, of my work, and his role in establishing the center, of course. And my first question is, what is the painting behind you, Mary?
Oh, I'm in my very crowded little den, and it's a painting that was, it's a watercolor that was done by a cousin of mine who lives in California.
It's wonderful, wonderful. I love the color.
Thank you. It's Venice, one of my favorite places, and which sadly we cannot visit at this time.
Soon, very soon. With each passing day, we're getting closer. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. And indeed,
Good.
An idea that I have for the role of our magnificent city of Buffalo to play when the sun returns on this planet, and indeed on America and on Buffalo come the spring, and how we're going to lead this country back into a very forward-looking and hopeful future, and also restart the wonderful economic resurgence that we just began to have some success with before this awful virus arrived. First and foremost, I think it's also a great honor to be among people who treasure books, who understand the power of narrative and story. I believe it's how we live, how we learn. It's certainly how I learn. And I think referring to the little work that you just held up that I published some years ago as a book is a very kind and generous way of describing it. It was a small attempt. Perhaps now is not a bad time to say, and I'm not a real writer, of course. I try and I aspire to be one. And in the wake of that book, now I think you say 2003 or 2004 when it was. So it's taken me this long, but I'm just a couple of months away from finishing my second book. And I only say that because, as you know, real writers don't like to discuss what they're working on, but we're confident now, even though my editor, who's neither English nor patient, is about ready to bring down the final gavel on it. You're kind enough to mention the civic work that I've done. I've always considered myself, and I have to say I really mean it, I've always considered myself the luckiest man on God's earth. I was born an American, which is an immense stroke of luck, over which, of course, we have no control. I was born to these two extraordinary parents, as all our parents are, but they were two remarkable people who came together, each from Buffalo. My mom was from Lackawanna, and my father from South Buffalo, and they were from very fine families, but they were each exceptional in their own families, and they came together and raised we 7 children. My father's, I think I wrote a little bit in the book, my father was an extraordinary extrovert and a young man like many of his generation in post-World War II who were very much at the end of that war in a hurry and looking to make his mark. He was a fiercely blessed with a fierce intellect and a very hardworking man. And my mother was this lovely, beautiful, brilliant educator. She was a remedial reading specialist in the Williamsville School District before she had her 7 students at home. And they created something that was just, even as a young person, I looking back on it in the second book that I've almost finished with, I really do, as you know, all of us who aspire to write, and if you're writing something about your own experiences, sometimes it's a little bit challenging to distinguish between your memory and your experience and perception in present day. I think the novelist Nicole Krauss, she once wrote that memory is an affirmative act, and which is so very true. We sort of remember what we want, and perhaps sometimes we put. But I've always admired, by the way, those great people and great achievers who also write, who don't mind, when they do write their memoirs or their autobiographies and the like. Winston Churchill comes to mind. Here was a man who had this extraordinarily desperate and difficult and sad childhood. And but if you read his memoir, he changes it into the story of inspiration and greatness. And I sometimes think that that's what great people do, is they create their own they create their own reality. And I think it's very American, by the way. Of course, his mother was American, and he was very proud of that. And I've noticed in my reading, I'm addicted to biography. That's all I read. It's terrible. I miss out on so much. I think it was Emerson once said that there is no history, only biography, and I'm a great believer in that. And so with respect to that first little effort or collection, to make a long story short, as many of us are, including Mary, all of us from Western New York, in the great tradition of the great theologian and philosopher Joseph Campbell, who wrote, about the reluctant hero and the power of myth, we all tend to go out from Buffalo and then come back. And thank God I came back. I always knew I wanted to. I spent some time as a corporate attorney on Wall Street in the 1980s. and I truly detested it. I'll tell you a great story. I was a young attorney in my second or third year in a very large law firm of about 430 attorneys. One of the attorneys was a former mayor of the city of New York named Bob Wagner, who was a lovely man. And he was sort of what they call a rainmaker. He was of counsel to the firm. And his father, of course, was the great senator who wrote the Wagner-Taft Labor Act. And he had a client, a real estate client, Bob did, who, again, I was very young, probably in my late 20s, and who was out in Queens and had a tremendous amount of property that he owned in Queens. And I met him a couple of times. I did this little sort of gopher work for him. And one day, Mayor Wagner stuck his head in my office and said, "Hey, listen, you got to come with me. We have to go midtown to this other law office because my client, his name is Fred, asked us to do a little deal for his son." And I said, "Sure." And we went off to this very sort of white shoe law firm, a great name, Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft. And there in this very posh conference room, there was a large real estate closing for a purchase of this big parcel on 42nd Street in Midtown Manhattan. This is in the 1980s, and it was still not really as ritzy as it is today. And I had one task in that meeting as the fourth. There were three senior attorneys above me, and all I had to do was carry this, what's called an overnight Fed funds check for the delivery at closing. And you put the money in the Fed funds account the night before, and you have to calculate what interest it makes overnight. It was a very large check for millions of dollars. And that was my sole job, just to make that calculation. So after the 3 or 4 hour closing, by the way, the son sat across from me from the conference table. I remember thinking two things about him. One was he was very handsome, and he was quite alive, but he was a young man. And I remember thinking that for some odd reason, he reminded me of Richard Nixon. And the reason was because he had these sort of darty, his eyes were darting, he seemed uncomfortable in his own skin, and quite, he was a successful, young, well-dressed, handsome guy, but he seemed completely insecure. So I, of course, just minded my own business until it was my turn. And it was my turn to announce the overnight Fed funds calculation. And I got it wrong. And I was off. And the son who was making this purchase across from me leapt out of his chair, stood, and started hurling these vulgarities at me. That how could I be so, such a horrible person and a horrible lawyer and all this. And Bob Wagner, who was very dignified and kind and old school attorney, who was sitting next to me, but I didn't really know him that well. By coincidence, he knew my father. He turned, in those days, by the way, in the practice of law was still very much a profession as opposed to a business. And there would be people who would stand behind you who would bring tea, or it was quite old school. And Mayor Wagner turned to the young man behind him and said, "Mr. Gaughan and I will have our coats now." And I thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble. I'm really going to get it now. And they brought our coats, and the mayor put my coat on me, and I put his coat on him, and we started walking toward the door, and the client, who was steam was coming out of his head, said, no, don't go. And the Mayor Wagner said, "No, Kevin, come walk with me. We'll walk to the elevator banks." And we got to the elevator banks, and finally the client came running around the corner, and the mayor turned to him and said, he said, I won't tell you his name. He said, "Mr. Smith, I won't have my associate spoken to in that manner, and you need to apologize." And again, I was a young person, but I was very struck how difficult it was for him to apologize. It took him about 15 seconds, and he finally said, "I'm sorry, Kevin Gaughan." And I said, "Don't worry about it." His name was Donald Trump. And that was my first exposure to Donald Trump. His father was Fred Trump, who was Mayor Wagner's client, and he was a lovely man. He was very, I know you read a lot about him. Somehow he's responsible for this Donald Trump fiasco, but my memory of him was very nice and kind and understated. He was a big real estate developer in Queens. But the lesson I learned in that experience was, oh, by the way, I went back to that office and I probably worked until midnight. I was walking on air because I felt Mayor Wagner knew who I was and defended me, and I felt worthwhile and valued. And for some reason, I wanted to tell you that Donald Trump story just to sort of, as we turn the page, which is a wonderful page to turn. And again, he has his strengths and he has his deficiencies. And I look forward. I hope I live long enough to see history. As you know, it takes 20 or 30 years to place him in proper context. So I grew up in this wonderful family. I had an awareness that I was fortunate. I think one of the great gifts that my parents gave all of my 6 brothers and my brother and 5 sisters, there were 7 of us, was a sense of fortune, of good fortune. Now he worked hard, and he was successful, and so he created opportunities for us. And I don't know, I can't understand why or explain it. It's not, I don't think in any way an attribute for me, but I took advantage of every opportunity that someone gave me. Of course, my mother being a remedial reading specialist, I think of the earliest memories I have, like a lot of blessed children, is my earliest memory is sitting on her lap and having her read to me. We lived on Lake Erie and in Hamburg, and she would sort of pick me up and walk me down the front lawn, and we'd sit on what we called the seawall. And she said we were going to watch the birds. Mothers put the baby birds to bed, and she'd pull out a book and read to me, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it, and it gave me the gift of interest in books. I went to a Catholic, typical Catholic parish, St. Mary of the Lake Grammar School, run by the Sisters of St. Joseph Order, and they were perhaps not the best teachers. But I remember that the only day that I was truly alive was on Thursdays, the bookmobile. There was no library in the school, and the bookmobile came. I remember the steps to the bookmobile were up to my neck, and I had to climb with my arms onto the first and second steps to get in the bookmobile. And I remember, of course, as we all do, the scent and the smell of the books, and it changed my life. It's all I wanted to do. I was a bit sickly when I was young. Sort of typical children's. There wasn't a disease I didn't get, and so I spent a lot of time actually out of school and in home, and any time I would wake up ill and not be able to go to school, I would find 5 or 6 books on my bed that my mother had chosen, and I'd spend the day reading. And I think that's where my interest came from. And I also should tell you that I have a vivid memory of my father, who was immensely interested in history, American history, and American government, by the way, was quite active in it. He gave us children a tremendous amount of gift. For some reason, I think he saw in me the interest I had in reading and in history as a young person. Not as much as he had, though. I remember on a particularly hot day coming home from Little League and playing baseball. And in those days, the Little League uniforms were thick cotton, and they scratched, and they were hot as hell, excuse me. And all you wanted to do at the end of baseball was, of course, jump in the lake. We had this Lake Erie, which my mother called our own personal air conditioner. And and I just loved to hop in the lake. And my father said, "Hey, Kev," my parents called me Kev. My mother called me Kevy, old boy. He said, "Hey, Kev, hop in the car. We'll go on an adventure. I got a good place I want to show you." And I said, by the way, now, the one thing about my father was, if you got in the car with him and he said it was going to be a half an hour, it could possibly be 2 or 3 days before you return. His sense of time was different, and you just didn't want to do it. And I said, "Daddy, please." And he said, No, come on, we'll be half an hour. And oh God. And so of course he wouldn't take no, and thank God he wouldn't. And we hopped in the car, and he had read, this is probably the late 1950s, early 1960s, perhaps. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and he must have read something about Theodore Roosevelt that piqued his interest. And he drove me into what was then we called the historical society, our Buffalo Niagara County History Museum now. And on a summer day, we went into the basement. I thought I was going to die. And we searched out the original diaries of the young Buffalo attorney who was great pals with Theodore Roosevelt and Wilcox, and during the fateful week and I think my father, I think looking back on that, he was thinking, that's literally less than 100 years when that in the 1950s. So he was looking at it as something that happened not that long ago. And we sat in the basement and we read Ansley Wilcox's diary of what took place in that month of September of 1901, when all the historic events took place. And I hated it for the first 15 minutes, detested it for the first half hour, but by the second hour, I was engrossed in it and the story. And then he drove me over on Delaware Avenue, to the of course the Wilcox Mansion. By the way, we all know the story of the Wilcox Mansion. That was actually the Rumsey family, right? And the great story there, the Rumseys, who of course the great landowners in North Buffalo, and they were sort of like the rich family of the 19th century of Buffalo, and the Ansley Wilcox married one of the daughters, his first wife, and then she passed away, and he married the second daughter of Mr. Rumsey. Some say to keep the house in his name, but in any event, my father showed me that, and of course the home of the other Buffalo attorney who was friends with McKinley, where McKinley died at Canisius High School. And so I had a very early gift of history, and it seemed to take. A lot of other things didn't take with me, but that did. So to move sort of far ahead, once I went through my little Buffalo sojourn, as we all do, of venturing out, and I think I just was trying to prove to myself. I'd read about Wall Street and attorneys, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. I never had any intention of making a life out of it, and I didn't enjoy it that much. Back to those conferences and closings, I learned a great deal. But by the time I came back, I'd finished, college in the mid-1970s, law school and graduate school in the early 80s, and spent the mid-1980s, about 7 years in Manhattan, practicing law, what's called securities law, corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, hostile takeovers, the despicable. And I proved to myself that I could do it, and I left and came back. So I arrived in the mid-1980s into, at that point, more than 2.5 now decades in which this magnificent city had been laying fallow since the collapse that began, of course, in the 60s and ended with the departure of the manufacturing base in Bethlehem Steel. We all know the story. And I was just struck by what I thought was the broken nature of Buffalo. I hadn't really truly fallen in love with it. It was in the course of the work that I started in the 1980s, late 80s and 90s. But I was struck by the depression, and by that I mean it was sort of like the thick of the culture that we're now just beginning to give it the slip. The culture in Buffalo of, that can never happen. We could never do that. We'll come back to that in a moment when we talk about the project in which I'm working on now. It's not an uncommon symptom in dysfunctional communities around America. I later learned when I did my regionalism work, but it's a death knell when there's a preponderance of sense that there's no moving forward, and there's nothing ever changes. The waterfront never changes. The socioeconomic status never changes, and the like. And so I took a sort of a silly job as a counsel, legal counsel to the Erie County Legislature, and I'm not a great lawyer. I admire those who are, but I love the law as well, and I love the tradition and history of the judicial process we have here. And there was a chairman of the legislature and the county executive at the time who realized that our court facilities were collapsing because there'd been no investment in them, and they were absolutely determined not to do anything about it, for the simple reason that they knew that if they did do it, they would have to raise taxes. This was, by the way, the beginning of the American era of, I think what was the Proposition 8 in California of attempting to keep property taxes under control. It happened in the late 70s, and people were, so they thought that I was young enough and wet behind the ears enough and silly enough to know that this was an awful project to take charge of, and they made me in charge of it, basically sort of protect them. And the idea was, the reason they did it was they had procrastinated for so long. The state of New York was about to impose financial sanctions and penalties on both the city of Buffalo and the county of Erie for not keeping the court facilities up. So I said, of course I'll do it, not knowing what I was getting into, and so I had to figure out how much it would cost to bring our court systems to compliance, where the needs were, and most interestingly, how you go about the process of hiring an architect to design a new facility. And this comes back to my father. My father is a very young man. He was 24 years old when he had 24 years old when he had an office in the White House. He was a special assistant to a president named Harry Truman. And years later, there was a very nice young man who was a special assistant to Bill Clinton. I'm going to draw a blank on his name. And he had his little office next to in the Clinton White House was where my father sat. And he was kind enough one day to let me come in and sit where my dad sat. His name was George Stephanopoulos. He's a journalist now. And I'll never forget, he was very kind. So, but anyway, my father was a special assistant. If you recall, during the Truman administration, there was a day on the third floor when when his piano fell from the third floor to the second floor because the White House had been a shambles and for years had not been invested in. And Harry Truman decided to do a complete interior renovation of the White House in the 1940s. You recall, he moved across the street. He lived in Blair House for 2 years. And Harry Truman, being Harry Truman, took it upon himself to put himself in charge of this renovation of the White House, and he spent many months driving around the country looking at other, architectural examples and the like. And so I took the example from him. And by the way, when that renovation was completed, Truman. The great story is Truman was sitting in Blair House one day, and they just gutted the White House, and you can see photographs. I don't know if it's extraordinary. The White House was just a big shell, and he was sitting in the Blair House one day talking on the phone with a pal, and these big trucks were going by his window, taking all of the innards of the White House and taking them away. So he said to his friend, "Hang on a second." He ran outside and he stopped a truck and he said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, we've been told to take just throw it in the Potomac River." He said, No. It's all historic material. But we lost most of it. We lost a great deal of it. But he gave instructions. I remember 10 trucks were left, and he said, no, go back. And so there was a limited amount of original material from the original White House. So when that renovation was completed, there was only enough material to create 22 mementos of original White House wood. And he made them, and he wanted to make 50. He wanted to give one to every governor, but there was only enough for 22. So as mementos of the renovation and made from original White House material. And he had them made in the form in the shape of a gavel, which symbolized his first office. He was a county judge, but he was actually a county executive. They called it county judge. So there were only 22 of them, and he gave one to my dad, which my brothers and sisters and I we treasure. We keep it in a vault at M&T Bank, but we take it out and show it to school children. So I was very much inspired by that story, and I went around the country and I looked at courthouses. I looked at the beautiful new West Palm Beach courthouse. And I interviewed a lot of architects. I looked at the new courthouse in the Howard Baker one in Tennessee, and I did all that. And in the course of, with a lot of assistance, of course, and people much smarter than me, but in the course of it, what I learned was that it wasn't just the courthouse renovation, but certainly all these major policies, much more important policies, of local governments in which I had absolutely no interest. Of course, like everyone else, I dreamt one day that I was going to be in Washington in the United States Congress. What I learned was that these levels of government not only did not communicate with each other, I should say not only did not cooperate, but they didn't even speak with each other. It was this dysfunctional mess. And it was adding to the ineffectiveness, the lack of equality, certainly the lack of inclusion, and of course, any type of forward-looking. And I could see very clearly that it was, and anyone could have seen, having had the experience that I had, could see that it was contributing to the dysfunction of the community. So coincidentally, it was the beginning of the age of the internet, just the very beginning. It was the embryonic phase, and I was learning about the internet and learning about computers and everything. And I literally stumbled across one day, I'm going to say in 1994 or 95, this new doctrine, this new thought process of approaching local government in America that had been proffered and advanced by a new generation of young local government leaders, mayors, and scholars and professors around the country. In research I did, and it was called regionalism. And I was very interested. And I did a lot of research. The first reference that I have found to the word regionalism was uttered by, of all people, Lyndon Johnson, in a speech he gave to the National Urban League in 1965. And he had a lot of bright urban policy folks who worked for him, including a former professor of mine at college. I draw a blank on his name. And they were the ones who recognized that in the post-war era, when coffers were full of money on every level, federal, state, local, there was no problem. There was enough money for everyone to advance. But as government resources dwindled and the revenue sharing stopped in the 1970s, the federal government used to every year ship millions and millions of dollars to places like Buffalo. That stopped in the 1970s. So it created this competition among cities, towns, villages, who should be working together, but were at each other's throat to try to compete. And most important, because of the racial aspect of the story, the American narrative, which we call the suburban age, of the flight from the urban centers in an attempt to escape the crime and racial unrest. And most important, of course, in the post-war era, the baby boomers and the GI Bill folks who were given opportunities. The American dream was the suburban parcel and the white fence and the like. So with them, as they left the urban centers like Buffalo, they took with them all the political influence and all the capital. So in that speech that Johnson gave, he talked about the need for American suburbs to not compete with the urban center, but rather collaborate with it and create and understand that in our instance, that Amherst's competition, the town of Amherst, wasn't the city of Buffalo or the town of Hamburg or the village of Alden. Their competition, and then of course the other aspect of this was this all took place against the backdrop of something that was happening in the 1980s, which was the introduction of the global economy. And smart people, forward-looking people were realizing that if you were in a community, Columbus, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Mecklenburg County, Charlotte, the place that took all of our folks, that you had to create not a Buffalo economy, not an Amherst economy, but a regional economy. You should collaborate together because your competition wasn't the local suburbs in the city, but rather Toronto or Nanking, China, or the Silicon Valley. And I was extremely excited about it. I thought it made so much sense. And I read everything I could. And I got in my car and I drove around the country and I found these folks who were proponents of it. And you were kind enough to mention a little bit ago that another place that my father introduced me to at a young age, the Chautauqua Institution, one of the great national treasures, America's original think tank. As we all know the story of Chautauqua. Chautauqua was the first think tank. It was the place to which Americans every summer would repair and gather and consider the most important policy questions of the day. And no one even knew it was in part of our region. And I've always treasured it. And that's why I sort of dreamt up this idea, because many communities in this time period, the early 1990s, they were adopting regional approaches. Places that like us, Cleveland, Mecklenburg County, Fairfax, Virginia, places that, with lovely communities, lovely people, couldn't hold a candle to the sense of place and the poetry of place and the history and the story that we have. They don't have Niagara Falls. They don't have the mighty Niagara. They don't have the story of Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln and everything here, but they were moving ahead. So I got the idea, well, why don't I if I could bring those folks, the government leaders, the business leaders, the education leaders, the spiritual community leaders, from those more functioning communities to this little conference. My original, I tend to think a little bit, as my father always said, a little bit too big. My original idea was to have a week-long conference. And my original plan for the evening the evening entertainment was the Rolling Stones. Unfortunately, Mick Jagger said, I'm a little busy. So instead we had a group from the Southern Tier called 10,000 Maniacs and the Buffalo Philharmonic. We had entertainment every evening. But they said, look, Kevin, people can't come for 7 days. So we had a 4-day conference. And it was murder. You'd think that I was asking Western New York's business leaders and political leaders and government leaders for their firstborn children. It was this huge fight and tension and resentment, and opposition. I'll tell you a secret, and it's been a secret throughout every one of these small civic initiatives that I've attempted, some of which have succeeded, many of which have not. I had a secret advisor, one of the wisest men you'll ever know, and who is still with us. He's elderly now, and he was part of the power structure. He was part of what we call the Group of 18, which is that secret society of men, and that whole tradition of people meeting in private clubs behind closed doors to make policy decisions for the whole community. And by the way, I took a measure of pride in the small achievements of the Chautauqua Conference. We brought an end to that period in Buffalo, and I'm very proud of that. But he was a very progressive guy, and he agreed to secretly, sort of like deep throat, meet or talk to me and tell me what the folks who were trying to stop us, what they were doing. Great guy, and has done so ever since. So we had the conference, and it was successful in that before the Chautauqua Conference, our here in Erie County, we have 45 governments, 25 town governments, 16 village governments, 3 cities, and the county. Adds up to 45 governments for, of course, less than 1 million people. And before the Chautauqua Conference, none of those governments collaborated in purchasing everything from road salt to bathroom tissue. And that was, of course, terribly economically inefficient and the like. And as a result of the Chautauqua Conference, they all agreed to make purchases together. It saved millions of dollars in property taxes and local taxes. More important, the cities, at the time of the Chautauqua Conference, the city of Buffalo was suing the town of Amherst they filed a $50 million lawsuit against the town of Amherst because Amherst had poached a couple businesses from downtown. You know how businesses left downtown and moved out to the suburbs. And at the conference, there was a nice young woman who was supervisor of Amherst at the time. I'm going to draw a blank on her name. She's been an adjunct professor at UB Law School for many years. I'll think of her. And the Buffalo Mayor, Tony Maciel, and I got them together at the conference, and they agreed to form an alliance. They called it the Sea, the Amherst-Buffalo corridor. And that Amherst-Buffalo corridor over the years has morphed into what we now call the Buffalo Niagara Development Association, along with our Buffalo Niagara Partnership. It's a collaborative regional entity that oversees that regional economy. And I also take a measure of pride in that, in fact, I'm very proud that some politicians, led principally by our present governor, Andrew Cuomo, very much picked up on it and made it the centerpiece of their agendas and the like. And Andrew's a bit of a, as you know, a sharp-elbowed politician, but very effective. And he took the germ of my idea and applied it to government policy. And as a result, we saw the regional entities. They were overseen by the wonderful Howard Zemsky. And in that way, again, those of us who worked so hard in the mid-1990s, we very much feel that we built the foundation of at least an opportunity for Buffalo to start, I should say for West New York, to start collaborating together. And it eventually led to, thank God, the little economic resurgence that we, again, started building up about 6 or 7 years ago, 8 years ago, and has been interrupted by the virus. Now, against that backdrop, and I've been battling too much already, I've always been sort of an amateur writer. I think my favorite two thoughts on writing, George, or of course, the wonderful David McCullough, the great historian, he once said, there's something about taking a pen to a pad, or of course, they're taking your fingers to the board, that just tends to organize, it forces you to organize your thoughts in a way that you couldn't otherwise. And I found that from a young age, very, very, very true. And George Will, the longtime columnist, who I disagree with a lot, but he's got a lovely mind. And someone asked him why he wrote, and he said, I write to discover what I believe, which is a very Jeffersonian idea, by the way. Jefferson had that feeling that he didn't really quite understand what he truly believed in unless he worked it out on paper. I'm going to digress for a moment. We have to keep this among ourselves, but the great thing about history, of course, is that it's so alive and it never ends, and we're all constantly learning more. And maybe perhaps some of our folks who are listening tonight already know this, but I was so delighted to. It's been about 3 or 4 years now. There was it's always in an attic. It's always in someone's grandmother's attic, and they're cleaning out the attic, and someone in Western Pennsylvania was cleaning out an attic just 5 years ago, and opened the trunk and finds this big, large diary of the young bride with her young baby, who had just married the bricklayer in Philadelphia, and they just bought the gorgeous home on the corner of, I think, Market and 7th Street. And they couldn't pay for the whole thing, so they decided to lease out the top floor as an apartment. And their first tenant was young Thomas Jefferson, coming to attend the Second Continental Congress, and he took that second floor. And this young girl with her little baby Frederick, a couple of times a week would climb the stairs to bring Mr. Jefferson tea. And she wrote in her diary what took place every time it happened. Just discovered, I think it was 2016. And here's what she wrote. She had a vivid memory of, first of all, she loved him. She was so lovely and dignified and courteous. And of course, strikingly good looking. She writes about everyone who met Jefferson. He had that shock of red hair and those features and blue eyes. She wrote all those blue eyes. But as she would mount the stairs, inevitably she would hear the strains of a Mozart violin concerto, which he played, of course. And once she knocked, she would hear him sort of rustle about and hide he was a little bit modest, he would hide the instrument, then he'd open the door. She remembered seeing the little desk that he, of course, designed himself to write the Declaration on, which is in the National Archives. She remembered seeing the violin in the case, and she remembered the papers strewn all over. She would give him the tea, he would thank her, and then she'd make her exit and go down and close the door and silently go down the stairs. And she wrote, I would only get halfway down the stairs when immediately again, the Mozart music would beautifully start seeping through the walls. She didn't use the phrase, but essentially what she wrote was, when Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, when he got writer's block, when he didn't know what else to do, he didn't go for a walk or he didn't make a sandwich, he played Mozart. And that's how he would get himself to the next stage, which is really a fabulous story. So anyway, so I took a measure of pride that those conferences. I thought at the end of the Chautauqua conferences that would solve, my naivete was beyond measure. I thought that's it, everything's going to be fine. And of course, the minor to the easy changes, what they call the low-hanging fruit, took place, and the politicians began speaking and began, saving money by making large bulk purchases and the like. We put together a regional planning commission, which the later county executive killed. Again, bear in mind the tension here is, if you cede influence to a region, then whatever municipality you're in, if you're a common council member in Buffalo, a village trustee in Hamburg, or a town board member in Amherst, you're reducing your power, you're reducing your autonomy, and it's just very difficult to, they call it the turf wars or the silos and the like. So anyway, that took place, and I was a little disappointed. I thought, wait a minute, nothing's really changed, and I became very cross. And again, I was still young in those days, and I thought, son of a gun, something's wrong here. And this goes back maybe to something somewhat interesting. Back to the idea that I'm the luckiest man who's ever lived. I was an American. I had great parents. I was born as a baby boomer. And I became aware, you know how we all, in the German tradition of the Bildungsroman, the story of our lives, I became aware in the most extraordinary time, in my judgment, of course, every generation thinks so, in American history, when a reckoning not unlike what we're experiencing today in Black Lives Matter, of course, is the civil rights movement in America. I was 8 or 9 years old in the early 1960s, the mid 1960s, at 10 and 11. And when I suddenly realized there was something beyond my backyard, the first thing I saw was this guy named Martin Luther King. And I saw this fury in people's behavior on the nightly news. And I went with my parents. My parents took me to demonstrations. My father was very active, and I didn't understand the anger, and I didn't understand the hatred. But what struck me was the gentleness and the power of these spiritual people. And there were several of them, like here in Buffalo at the time, included a young Arthur Eve, and I remember them all. And a young Frank Messiah, I remember them all vividly, and it struck me. And of course, I didn't realize at the time, but history did show that the civil rights movement in America succeeded not in the political arena. It didn't succeed in the business arena. It didn't succeed in sports. It succeeded in the spiritual life, in congregations and churches. And so the idea that I thought to myself, why didn't the Chautauqua Conference end this fragmentation between urban and suburban, and this idea? To this day, by the way, you could travel as I have, go up and down streets in the town of Cheektowaga and go door to door and knock on people's door and ask them when was the last time they were in Buffalo, and they say, I'd never go to Buffalo. Some people spend their whole lives in Cheektowaga and never go in the city of Buffalo. Now that's changing, thank God. But I thought to myself, if these politicians why are they getting away with this fragmented government? And I thought, well, if there's fragmented government, it means there must be fragmented people. And I started thinking about how I could redress the fragmentation among people, because then if they living together more, if not physically, at least politically, that they would compel the politicians to change. And that's where I got the idea I think it was my second project of centering the activity in our places of worship. I called it the region-wide conversation. To make a long story short, I think I found out there were 36 different denominations here in Western New York, and I got the head of every one to come to a meeting. And by the way, that was the early days. They had just built the first Hindu temple, and the Islamic population, the mosque. There was a mosque in Cheektowaga, Fajri Ansari, who's head of the mosque there, who is a Buffalo State professor, I believe, and an athletic. I think he coached the basketball team for many years. So to make a long story short, I got them all to agree to buy into this program that I just sort of devised in my head. And the idea that I had was there was a term then called the soccer mom, the suburban soccer mom. And I thought about her, and I thought about the inner city African-American mom who gets up her kids and says, hey, when you go to the bus station, be sure to dodge the bullets, because, you know, you try to keep your head low, as these urban, violence was still the scourge. And the theory that I had was that if somehow a soccer mom could spend time with an inner city African-American mom, they would look at each other and recognize one another. And so that gave rise to this idea of having, if you were a member of a Presbyterian parish, or I should say congregation in Orchard Park, you join with an inner city African-American Baptist church. And for about six weeks, you would go to each other's churches and have these conversations. And it worked out pretty well. I was very proud of it. I'm not sure if it changed anything. It was adopted, I think, by 4 or 5 other cities around the country, and I took a great measure of pride. And it just helped. It helped build awareness about the suburban-urban disparity of opportunity and the like.
Kevin, I'm sorry to get you in mid-sentence. If you can conclude that thought, I think we need to move to questions because our host institution closes at 8 o'clock. So we have only about a half hour to address what I think will be many questions. So if you could conclude your thought, and then Michaela will take over with the questions. Is that all right?
Well, thank you for stopping me. I think I gave more than a flavor of what I was attempting to do. In the course of doing all that, the reason I started writing, I viewed my writing as to borrow a Franklin Roosevelt phrase, as an arsenal in the push for regional consciousness. So by virtue of the work, I had this great privilege of getting all these wonderful invitations to speak to groups, and I was speaking with groups, maybe 3 or 4 a week. And also, most important, can you imagine the privilege? I think there was in several years in which I would speak to literally thousands of different groups and schools and colleges and high schools. Oh, it was the greatest privilege in the world. And I thought adding written explanations or deeper analysis of what we were trying to do would help the work. And that's why I started publishing the essays, which were collected in that book.
Great. So any of the participants that have questions, you can use the Q&A feature now. I don't have any questions waiting for me, but Marianne, if you have questions for Kevin, go ahead and we can get those answered and wait for some people to ask some questions.
I do. I have a couple of questions about the effort to downsize, essentially, government that was successful when you had West Seneca and Alden and others reduce the number of folks that they employed. But then that over time was reversed. And what is the reason in your mind why the initial agreements to downsize didn't stick?
That's a magnificent question. The good news is the importance of the downsizing movement did stick. And I'll come back to that. And this sort of picks up sort of just where I was, and I'll make it very quick. So we did the region-wide conversation, and then we did our canal conversation to help save the Erie Canal. But now it's like 2003, 2004, 2005, and still our city's not moving forward. We didn't begin our resurgence until 2012 and the like. And every year we're losing population. Between 1975 And 2006, the New York Times reported in a front page article in 2006 that between 1975 and 2006, Western New York, Erie and Niagara County, lost 294,000 people. 294,000 people, more people than any community ever lost in the entire recorded history of America. And among those 294,000, we lost, are you ready for this? We lost 33.4% of people between the ages of 18 and 34. And you could see it on the street. There was no young people here. They left, by the way, not because they wanted to, not because they didn't like us, but because we offered them absolutely no opportunity and even less hope. So, of course, with that population decrease, we went through this series of what happens when it's a fundamental change. And what happens when things change? Everyone is forced to adapt. An amoeba, a human being, a company, a school, everyone has to adapt. Families had to downsize. Businesses had to downsize. We had to consolidate our hospital system. We had to consolidate everything, except one thing, government. Government seemed to just keep churning on as if nothing had changed. And a government, I don't like these, politicians who say government should be run like a business. Of course, that's wrong. But governments are like businesses in this way. I could never figure out all the years business. I'm not a businessman, but I had to learn it to do my reform work. When you speak to a businessman or a woman, they'll say, you say, how's your business? They say, well, here's the deal. I have to, every year I have to grow. I have to grow or I die. And I never understood why that was. The reason is whatever your business is, whether you manufacture something or provide services, every year the cost of manufacturing those things and providing those services go up. So if your customer base doesn't increase, you can't survive. It's because it's the way capitalism works. Everything goes up. Likewise in government services, what they do, what they deliver. Here in Western New York, they do a magnificent job, but the cost goes up every year. So if you're in the town of Hamburg, which went from 85,000 people in 1975 down to 52,000 people in 2004, and you have government every year providing services that cost them, what happens is year after year, that government is taking more money from fewer people. And that produced what we had here in Western New York, which is there's 3,182 counties in America. I'll say that again, there's 3,182 counties. Of those, here in Erie County, we pay the 4th highest local property taxes in America. That's what the research that I did in the cost website shows. And that's why people were moving away, because they couldn't afford the cost of owning a home, running a business, raising a family, or living here. And that's why they all moved out. So by now I'm sort of pulling the hair out of my head, and I'm still giving it thought. And in 2004, 2005, and so I came up with this idea of truly trying to understand. And again, my father always taught me, you can't just read about something, you got to go and look and feel it. So I came up with this idea of going to each of the 25 town halls, the 16 village halls, the 3 city halls, and county hall. And I went to each of these areas in our region. And by the way, that was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And I would live for 2 weeks in each town or village or city. And my students and I would come, and every day we'd go to that municipality. We would learn everything. We'd interview people. We'd find out what they did. We found out how much it cost. What an extraordinary experience. It was. I knew we were onto something. We were in one town. I couldn't have, and there was an assistant accountant to the village clerk, and she took me through 3 rooms and into a 4th room and kept closing door after door. And we went in deeper and deeper and deeper in, and then she finally closed the door. She turned to me and she said, "Thank God you're here. No one has asked these questions in 15 years." So I knew we were going to provide some information to people that they didn't have. And as you mentioned kindly before, we produced this report that basically showed how much every government here cost. And most important, it illuminated how, if you added up all the costs of the number of politicians in all the suburbs, you could see everything being drained from, the donut hole of the city of Buffalo. And I thought that was wrong. And and I knew that if I could get that information out, perhaps people would respond. So we produced the report. And in the course of doing that, again, going back to the gift of reading, When I was young, I can remember as a teenager, I would come home after a night of carousing on Elmwood Avenue, and it would be 3 o'clock in the morning, and my father would be there lying in bed reading. He was a terrible insomniac, and he read all night. I thought to myself, I'm never going to be like that. I'm exactly like that. All I do is read. I can't sleep, and I read. And I'm a bachelor poster child, so there's not much else happening, and I tend to read. And in the course of doing that report, I started reading the New York State laws that created all these municipalities. Local governments in America are created by the state government, and in our case, Albany. And this is about 2005. And one night about 4 o'clock in the morning, I was, of course, reading the New York State town law, which I would not recommend, drier than the Sahara Desert. And I came across a provision in the law that no one had ever seen before, no one had ever read thoroughly, and no one had ever applied. And what the provision said was, here in New York, we as Americans, by the way, I did research, it was a assemblyman in 1932 at the height of the Depression in the county, Columbia County, just north of Dutchess and Westchester. And he was the one who put this provision in. And he stood up in the New York State legislature one day and said, hey, look, I read our state constitution, and I suddenly noticed there's no right of petition. The fundamental American idea in democracy is that every citizen has the right to petition their government for grievances. And he said, we've got to codify that. And they said, no. And he said, no, you've got to be able to think of California. California, you can put anything on a ballot. You can have they have a proposition for everything. They overdo it a bit. But New York didn't have any right for a citizen to circulate a petition and get signatures and put something on a ballot. But the one right he got in there was, which I came across, it said a town board may, in other words, if they want to, or must reduce their number of politicians if citizens come forward with a petition with a number of signatures. And I remember I jumped in bed and I jumped up high and I hit my head on the ceiling because I knew I found something. And it turned out no one had ever exercised it. So to make a long story short, we started this. When I went to each of those town villages, I spoke before the town boards and the village trustees. Forgive me, God. I disclosed this in my new book. I would write them, and I'd say, look, may I please address the politicians? They thought I was coming to speak to them. I had no intention of speaking to them. What I wanted to do was speak to the people who would come and watch it. And I wanted to get their email addresses, and I wanted to get their names. So when I went to each of those 25 towns and 16 villages in 3 cities, we came away with some 3,000 emails. And we divided this wonderful citizen group, which we called Let People Decide. And we started this extraordinarily powerful, it had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with anything except the powerful American idea that if you take a piece of paper and say to your neighbor, hey, Joe, if you sign this, even if the politicians don't want you to, we can have a referendum and you can decide the size and cost of your own government. And that was a powerful idea. And we did it. And again, at the time, there was literally nothing happening here. And people were convinced that nothing could happen. And the way I put it, Mary, is, and I have to confess, people sort of thought that the purpose of my little movement there, of our movement, was to reduce the number of politicians. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to restore a sense that you could change here in Buffalo. A very powerful wave. And again, it gave rise to what we saw before this virus arrived. In a small way, it helped create the platform that made things happen again. And I'm very proud.
That's fascinating.
Now, the fact that, of course, they went back, as you said, and in the last couple of years, we caused, I'm proud to say that I've placed more propositions on ballots than anyone in New York State's history. I'm very proud of that, only as a Buffalo boy. We caused 17 referenda. We didn't, it was just, the point was, people would say, oh, Kevin Gaughan, you did this. I didn't do anything. Voters made the changes, and they reaped the save with property tax reductions and the like. And putting them back, that's just politicians. That's the nature of politicians. They'll gravitate to more power.
Thank you.
We don't have any Q&As right now, but Marianne, I think we only have like time for one or two more questions if you have them.
I had a question about the Peace Bridge expansion that was mentioned in one of the book's articles from 1999. And I don't know anything about the background of the Peace Bridge, and I'm not sure that it's relevant to this discussion, but there appeared to be some significant lack of cooperation that ultimately did not lead to a bridge expansion. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. The Peace Bridge and the idea, again, if you think about it, once the global economy took hold in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a sentiment and a right sentiment, a correct sentiment that Buffalo being placed on an international border could be a great beneficiary of this new global economy as goods and services were no longer, and also capital was no longer being constrained by political boundaries. Capital was now sort of floating above countries, nations, cities, towns, and that Buffalo could be this great centerpiece of, or clearinghouse, if you will, of goods and services going back and forth between Canada and the United States. But of course, the bridge that we had is this narrow thing built by Frank Baird and his friend Walter Shelkoff and Matt, not Matt Urban, what was Urban's name? Back in the early 20th century, and it needed an expansion. And also that would be, of course, a great opportunity to build what we called they used to call it a signature. I used to call it a landmark. You know, something that would be beautiful, inspiring, like the Golden Gate Bridge. And the lack of government's ability to organize itself, conduct the study, hire an architecture, do it something, make it a worldwide, it just collapsed into a fiasco and nothing ever took place. So that like our waterfront became a symbol of the dysfunction. And and then what happened was, of course, time passed us by. I think it was a little town outside of Detroit. Do you know when you read a couple of years ago about Detroit coming back? Now Detroit is terrible problems, but they have changed from what they were the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the reason is because they got ahead of us. They built a new bridge, and that's where all the goods and services that transfer between Canada and the United States, they go through there. Windsor, Ontario, I think it's near,
Right.
Instead of here. And now time has passed us by, and it's no
A
longer.
missed opportunity. Yeah. Going back to your previous discussion about a future book, can you give us some sense of when that book might appear, given that your publisher is chomping at the bit?
I'm horrible. I'm hoping that we're going to publish in the autumn of next year. And the book is essentially, the book that you have is just, a very small regional book and a regional publisher. And but for some reason, people were sort of interested in it, and I was very, very grateful. So they came up with this idea of writing a second book, and I resisted it because I just didn't think I had anything else to say. But then one night I was thinking about it, and I called and I said, listen, I'd be thinking about it if I could do this. Can the purpose of the book be to discuss the mistakes that I made? And she said, oh, that's sort of interesting. And I said, if you'll let me organize the book around mistakes, so God help them, if some other Kevin Gaughan comes along someday, read this, and it's not going to be it's going to be a young woman. Some young woman comes along and says, by the way, what we haven't discussed is I'm a firm believer in the importance of civic leaders in this country. We go through periods, we go back, the pendulum swings back and forth. Some periods, political leaders are the change agents, government, politicians. That's certainly not the age in which we live today. Sometimes it's business leaders. Remember the age of Bob Wilmers? He was the one who was sort of leading. But the most fertile and forward-looking and exciting periods in America are when it's just citizens and civic leaders and civic organizations that are, some like Martin Luther King is good. Are the young people who stopped the Vietnam War. That was the second thing that inspired me, that made me think that I could actually do this type of work. I mean, where does that ego come from? It's just horrible. So I said, what I'd like to do is write a book that explains and gives the signposts of these mistakes so that maybe they make their own mistake. So they thought that was an interesting idea, and that began. Then about halfway through, she called and she said, some of this is coming along okay, but it doesn't make sense. People are going to want to know why, this all happened, and they wanted to know a little bit more personal stuff, which I was sort of resisting, but they talked me into it. So it's actually a book. It tells the story of my parents and this unique experience that it was growing up as a baby boomer in this type of family in America, in Buffalo, and how that ended up making me think that I could have something to say about I'll only tell you one thing, which is I was rereading Victor Hugo's. I was attempting to reread Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and which is so difficult for me. But I stole something from him. I noticed he organized that book. Each of the chapters are characters. So at this point, I was writing principally about my family and some of my father's experience and some of these extraordinary, unique experiences that I've been blessed with that I didn't deserve. So anyway, so the book is organized. Each chapter is it's organized among my brothers and sisters, and so there's 7 chapters, and so there's a memoir dimension to it, but it also gets into this work and completes the story from whenever that book was published to this project that I'm working on now. It has more to do with our Frederick Homestead parks.
Okay, but you're skating the question of the timeline.
Oh, we're hoping it to be part of next autumn 2021.
Okay.
We'll have to have you back when the book is out for another book club.
Don't make the mistake twice.
So we do have one question from our participant, and it kind of relates to what you just had remarked upon, is that you had thoughts and stories and remarks on Olmsted, and this participant wants to know more about that.
Well, I've been working now for the past 5 years, God in heaven, on a project to help improve our city of Buffalo's magnificent Frederick Law Homestead system of parks and parkways, specifically South Park and Delaware Park. And to make a long story short, I don't play golf. I'm not interested in golf. Who has the time? It's a lovely sport. But as we know, there's these golf courses in our Homestead parks. It didn't just happen here in Buffalo. During the course of the 20th century, these homestead lands across America, in Chicago, Milwaukee, Toledo, other cities, they put golf courses and they destroyed the original designs of the master homestead. So in South Park, where we have our botanical gardens, there was a beautiful arboretum that Homestead designed that is now covered by a golf course. I got this idea. It's a sort of a complex one, but I formed a charitable company. We purchased about 125 acres next door to South Park. I talked this lovely man who apparently was a magnificent golf player named Jack Nicklaus, who's now the world's leading golf course designer. He's agreed to design a new course right next to South Park for free, so that we can pull the golf course out of South Park, restore Olmsted's Arboretum, have this new public park and public golf course, a beautiful golf course. And he's agreed to redesign the Delaware course, make it a little bit smaller so that we can restore more of Olmsted's original meadow in Delaware Park, hopefully leading to eliminating the Scajaquada. We'll talk about that. So I hope I live long enough. And the terrible damage that did to that beautiful space. And then we're going to bind the new Olmsted Restored Arboretum and Jack's beautiful design with what this is really about. And it seems to me, I'd like to think that the hallmark of all these little modest efforts that I undertake is education. We're going to bind them with a new education center, a STEM and vocational training center for inner city kids who are never going to see inside of a college. The way I got Jack Nicklaus to say yes to all this, he was the son of a gun. He's a tough son of a gun. We've become very close. He's a great guy. As you know, I've brought him here a couple of times. He's just dying to start this. We're just trying to raise the money. But I said, look, I'm not asking you to build a golf course. I want you to build an outdoor classroom that we're going to use for education purposes. And that's when he said, I'll do it. So we are still in the fundraising phase. We're looking to break ground on May 1st next year. It's going to be one of the first. It's going to be one of the first public gatherings in America without masks. And we're going to do it here in Buffalo. And just like on that beautiful evening in September of 2001, 2 weeks after William McKinley was assassinated and the country went into national mourning, and all the lights of the Pan American Exposition were off for 6 days. You know what happened? They decided on the 7th day to put all the lights back on. And they asked every Buffalo resident throughout the city to put every light on in their home and every light on in their business. And on that night, all the lights, all the Edison lights and the Tesla lights here in Buffalo lit the world. And that was the moment when the 20th century, the American century, began. And we're going to replicate that with these new beautiful Olmsted Parks groundbreaking this spring. We're going to begin the new era post-COVID, and we're going to lead the country back to a confident, forward-looking American spirit.
Great.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Michaela, do you have any more questions?
Well, we do have, I think, to close it out, one of our participants is wondering how he can get a signed copy of At First Light.
That's extraordinarily kind. If you could just, if you get, maybe if you could ask them to, they could just email. I'd love to give them would be very honored. My email is, it's very easy. It's Kevin at Kevin Gaughan. That's one word, Gaughan, Kevin at kevingaughan.com. And boy, we'd be honored to do that. That would be great fun.
All right.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your thoughts and the time that you've devoted. And we hope that to know more about the new book when it comes out, because this book was very interesting and has certainly stimulated a lot of thought about what we as part of the community should and could be doing. So thank you so much.
That's from the bottom of my heart. Thanks so much. God bless us all.
Yes, and everyone, book club for next year, January, will be joining us in the new year. Book club will be on January 7th with authors Lou Michael and, Lou Michael and Dan Herbeck with the book American Terrorist Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing. So that'll be in January, and they'll be joining us for that book club. So stay tuned.
That will be a different conversation than we had tonight. Okay, thank you so much again.
Thank you. God bless.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
It's a great honor.
Happy holidays, everyone. Bye-bye.